English teachers, of course. Welcome back, and today we will be discussing John Steinbeck's 1936 novella Of Mice and Men and its relevance in today's society. But before we do that, let's jump into a review of what the book was about. John Steinbeck's 1937 novella Of Mice and Men tells the story of two ranch workers, George Milton and Lenny Smalls, who arrive at a ranch in search of work and to escape the trouble they had in their previous town, Weed. George is described as a small man with a sharp mind, which is the opposite of Lenny. Lenny acts as if he had the mind of a child and is innocent, which results in him getting into a lot of trouble, which George typically has to get him out of, which George also finds very stressful. They both have a dream of owning their own ranch someday, and Lenny wants to tend to the rabbits. For him, tending the rabbits is a form of comfort, which we learn about throughout the book. On arriving at the ranch, they both meet the owner and his son Curly, who makes life on the ranch difficult as he is a pugnacious man. In addition, they also meet a variety of workers who also have their own stories and dreams. As the story progresses, death is present frequently, from the death of a dog, which progresses even more severely to the death of Curly's wife, whom Lenny accidentally killed. Lenny flees and tries to hide from the poor men. Lenny flees and tries to hide from the men who are chasing him while George is searching for him in order to rescue poor distressed Lenny. Ultimately, George finds him by the creek and then shoots Lenny dead, ending the book. Steinbeck covers many themes that were risky to discuss during his time. Of these themes, such as sexism and racism, disabilities, and ableism played an important role throughout the book. At the very beginning of the novel, George is teaching Lenny their backstory in case he is asked why they're working together. Typically during this time period, it wasn't common to see men working so closely together like George and Lenny were. Usually it was some sort of scheme, and many wouldn't want to risk it. So Lenny then asks George why he has to lie about George being his cousin, to which George replies viciously, "Be a damn good thing if you was. Save everybody a hell lot of trouble." Lenny then says, "You said I was your cousin, George." "Well, that was a lie," George responds, "and I'm dad glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself." And this is in chapter 1. So this is very early on in the novel, and we're already off to an introduction of who these characters are and the stress that's been put on George taking care of Lenny. Since Lenny had the mind of an innocent child, he understands that lying is wrong, and he knows that George isn't his cousin. He doesn't understand the severity of the trouble they could get into if the owner of the ranch found out about their previous problem in Weed. Which, little context behind that, Lenny is falsely accused of raping a young woman in a red dress, even though all he did was hold on to it and was scared when she started screaming, which they're then chased out of the town. So he doesn't understand the severity of the problem they could get into. George is watching over Lenny all day. He's sort of a big brother to him. George finds it stressful to take care of Lenny consistently and to make sure Lenny does not get into any sort of trouble. Shifting over to the Great Depression, the time period in which the book and its events are set, Steinbeck is true to the accurate portrayal of people with disabilities living in a not-so-welcoming society that was at a turning point of change, especially after the Buck vs. Bell case. According to Disabling Lawyering, Buck vs. Bell and the Road to a More Inclusive Legal Practice, an article focused on the case, Buck vs. Bell was the infamous Supreme Court case to which the highest court held that a Virginia statute permitted the compulsory sterilization of disabled people constitutionally. Lombardo's thorough research captures both the systematic factors at play in Buck and its aftermath. It also captures the personal story of Carrie Buck, whom Virginia officials selected to serve as the plaintiff in the case and who was ultimately sterilized by the state. In paragraph 3, the following paragraph, the author states that given the often enormous consequences that interactions with the legal system can have for disabled individuals and the damage that the legal system has wrought on the disabled community, legal advocates would do well to heed demystifying disability's key themes of understanding paternalism and being an accomplice to the disabled community. Analyzing this evidence, we learned that, in short, life was miserable for people with disabilities, up to the point where members of the disabled community were being forcibly sterilized in order to ensure they wouldn't produce offspring that would carry on their disabilities. Although I didn't include it into this exact piece, in the quote, people that live with disabilities were segregated in schools, the workforce, and society altogether. That was the normal back then. Often they were viewed from being stupid, incompetent, and crazy, all the way to taboos and curses to be condemned by the church. It wasn't until later in the 1930s, such as when this case was held, that advocating for equal treatment and rights for the entire disabled community began. Jumping into today's modern world, the novel isn't as accurate in the portrayal of the treatment of disabled community. We as a society have become more inclusive and have been changing for the last 80 years. According to the concerns about ableism and the amplified behaviors analysis and evaluation of recommendations, the struggle against ableism has continued for decades. In the 60s, the civil rights movement had inspired the disabled community to fight for legal protection and rights. This led to the Rehabilitation Act of 1938 that secured a future for all children with disabilities in the education system and banned discrimination against disabled folk. Although these laws had passed, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was later passed to protect all the citizens of the U.S. with all levels of ability in the workplace, schools, and all communities, opening up equal opportunities for the members of the disability community. Then, in 1999, Gigi Singer coined the term neurodiversity and initiated the neurodiversity movement. Neurodiversity takes the concept of biodiversity and is used to understand the functions of the brain as well as mental illnesses with disabilities. Soon after the movement began, the advocacy for the rights of neurodivergent people, such as their full inclusion in everyday activities as well as freedom from abuse, progressed and laws were passed to ensure the fair inclusivity in the education system and workforce was mandatory. This specific piece of evidence ties together the last century of progression we as a society have made in order to become more inclusive to members of the disabled community, in contrast in the world almost 100 years ago. It displays our efforts to advocate and work to bring justice in the legal system and overall functioning community, to open up the doors for opportunities for everyone. Steinbeck was a courageous author for writing about so many sensitive topics during his time, especially in Of Mice and Men. Although the novella itself did not have as a happy ending as a few of its readers would have hoped, it presents the reality of harsh treatment for those with disabilities and how they were treated harshly for something they had no control out of. It leaves the readers thinking about how different the world is now compared to how it was all those years ago and how much more change there is to come. The end.